According to traditional accounts, monasteries experienced most of the Viking pillaging and life was eradicated, so the church had to be rebuilt from scratch by Alfred the Great, now a questionable assumption. Located in a region of Kent that bore the full burden of Viking raids in the later 8th and early 9th centuries, the Lyminge monastery not only survived but also recovered more completely than historians previously thought. Dr. Gabor Thomas from the University of Reading concluded his research, published in the journal Archaeologia, that the monastic community at Lyminge persisted for nearly 2 centuries following the monastery's establishment in the second half of the 7th century. Monasteries, strategically located on estuaries and rivers, played key roles in mediating responses to Viking threats, including military actions, but also non-military interactions. Stick around to find out more. Kent was no longer an autonomous kingdom like in the 7th century, when it used to be the most powerful one under Ethelbert, when it even experienced the arrival of someone as important as St. Augustine. It was then subsumed to Mercia in the 8th century, which expanded territory, but still remained very rich and important, including the monastic wealth. The position made it highly vulnerable to Vikings, as a peninsula sticking out in the North Sea raided successively in the early phases, with some raids dating back perhaps to earlier than the 8th century. Lyminge's significance as a site of early Christianity is evident in its hagiography and documented history. The Kentish royal legend links Lyminge to Queen Ethelburga, the daughter of Ethelbert of Kent, who is said to have founded the monastery in 633 AD. The modern church in Lyminge is dedicated to her, suggesting a long association between the site and the saint. It is also a very well documented monastery, at least in comparison to others, thanks to the charters, that is, kings granting lots of estates and resources to monasteries. It was probably founded in the final third of the 7th century as a nunnery or even a double monastery, that is, both monks and nuns, on the Frankish model. We're dealing with a cluster of nunneries established by the ruler of Kent, acting in unison, attending synods together, for example. Like similar institutions, Lyminge played a role in promoting the influence of the Kentish dynasty. Charters dating to around 800 AD associate Lyminge with Sinethryth, a Mercian noblewoman who served as an abbess in Minster in Thanet, demonstrating the site's connection to wider networks of power and patronage in early England. The 11th century hagiographer Gosselin of Saint-Bertin described the transition of relics from Lyminge to St. Gregory's Priory in Canterbury in 1085. This account suggests Lyminge had acquired additional relics aside from those of Ethelburga. This detail lends credence to the argument that the monastery's main saint was not Ethelburga but Edburg, potentially the same Edburg who succeeded Mildred as an abbess in Minster in Thanet. While the identity of Lyminge's primary saint is unclear, the presence of relics and their subsequent transition to Canterbury demonstrates the site's significance within the landscape of early English Christianity. At the same time, we shouldn't mistake it for a late medieval monastery with a very clear structure. It is a much more diffuse layout, entire landscapes on considerable areas, multiple points of reference, cemeteries spread apart, more atomized communal buildings, and despite the stone church standing in the middle of the landscape, which was built in the 7th century, there are lots of industrial and agricultural activities spreading across acres, which tells us a lot about the central role in production and trade. Of course, within the churches we do have the perhaps expected portable wealth in the form of decorated objects like chalices, crosses or tapestries. Major destruction and complete abandonment were not actually the rule, except on 1 or maybe 2 sites with a presumed raid, like Withhorn and Port Mahomet, with the pathology of violence and smashed sculptures, as well as fire evidence. Lyminge, through carbon dating and large excavation, allows us to have a broad chronology showing a shift to a new location that followed an abandonment in a place in the landscape. In Kent, there are smaller quantities of coinage compared to East Anglia or Northumbria, since regional economies were at work at the time, making settlements in southern England more difficult to date. We can rely on pottery, but that gives us a range of about 100-150 years, thus carbon dating is needed here. And analyses of the report show that occupation on the site continued beyond 804, with evidence of domestic life and rubbish, houses, wealth, and so on. Monastic life was re-established on the site. The Charter of 804 records that a refuge in Canterbury had been granted to the community in Lyminge, showing that people did seek active ways to cope with the danger, most likely Norse piracy. Furthermore, Kentish charters issued on behalf of the Mercian overlords in these decades demonstrate that the usual immunities enjoyed by monastic enterprises with regard to military service and the maintenance of bridges and fortifications were withdrawn so that their assets and resources could be channeled into a defensive strategy against the Viking foe. Extensive excavations in Lyminge, covering nearly 2 acres, have provided a detailed chronological framework through radiocarbon dating, coin findings, and artifacts. The evidence shows spatial shifts in settlement patterns over the long 9th century and beyond, allowing a meaningful dialogue between archaeology and historical sources. The paper details the evolution of the settlement according to several phases. We have the Middle Saxon focus, with an early Lyminge between the 5th and 7th centuries situated around a spring with later shifts to higher ground. Excavation reveals that Middle Saxon occupation, including a large timber building, can be interpreted as a threshing barn and possibly funded through Mercian investment. During the late Saxon transition, radiocarbon dating indicates the monastic settlement's end between 835 and 1120, likely before the late 9th century. This timing aligns with the increased Viking incursions in Kent during 880 and 890, suggesting a connection between these events and the monastic community's decline. We also have the Norman period resettlement, following a probable hiatus settlement re-emerged in the early 10th century, likely tied to renewed investment in Lyminge as an ecclesiastical centre. Thus, in the latter stage of the 9th century, occupation stops dramatically here as well, but it is re-established again on a different site. According to the report, the mid-9th century marks a significant watershed with a noticeable change in monastic life. This period saw a reduction in consumption and economic activity, along with a reconfiguration of associated occupations. So, no obliteration nor complete displacement. To quote from the paper, while very much exemplifying the general long-term persistence and stability of early medieval focal places, Lyminge exhibits a fluid pattern of spatial development over the 5th, 12th centuries and embracing multiple location shifts accompanied by more subtle changes in the spatial extent and configuration of each location. Despite these changes, there was no total collapse, but rather a persistence of life, albeit in a more attenuated form. In the 880s, we do have substantial Viking armies in Kent, in Canterbury, in political centres at any rate, while they start to overwinter in places like the Isle of Sheppey, showing occupation and not only raiding. Lyminge was finally abandoned in this context of political conquest, if you will. But it was not destroyed from the start, and it did manage to take shape again, which is something you can also notice on other sites, in Repton for example. Repton suffers destruction, but partially in the 8th century. Vikings take over, but it keeps being used as a burial site, so still in existence in some form. In Kent we do notice the same thing, not just destruction for the sake of it. For example, the stone church stood until the Norman construction of the parish church. Vikings didn't really have a religious motivation, not at all. They were just very pragmatic, because they've also noticed the breadth of communities and their very productive nature, so in the sense they became somewhat parasitic, since there is a reason for keeping the place from going extinct from the very first time. More opportunities in the future. In conclusion, contrary to popular perception, the monks at Lyminge were not helpless victims, but instead implemented effective defensive strategies that allowed them to persist for nearly 2 centuries. Such research highlights the need for a more nuanced understanding of the experiences of monasteries during this very chaotic period in British history. It is necessary thus to emphasize processes of transformation rather than complete destruction, as we do find significant strands of continuity in religious life across the Viking Age. If you're curious about the exact changes and movements within the monastic settlement, you can find a link of the paper in the description. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching or listening. This was Irina, and do continue with my video on the beginnings of the Viking Age, because there are some things that will definitely surprise you. Thanks again, and till next time.